And we are recording. Thank you, Professor Irvan Abrahamian. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Abrahamian, yes, that's right.
Abrahamian, excuse me, Professor Abrahamian. Professor Abrahamian is a prolific writer. He is the author of many, many books. One of them, The History of Modern Iran, that was published in the year 2008. And one of the more recent books I've read, The Coup of 1953. That was a book focused on the U.S. and British orchestrated overthrow of the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh to replace him for the Shah. Professor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I've done.
This is our discussion is going to be a little bit about modern Iranian history, but with a focus on the legacy of the late Ayatollah Khomeini. And my first question to you is, what set off the events that gave Khomeini the ability to take power in a nation previously ruled by a monarchy?
Well, the revolution took actually something like 14 months of street protests. And what triggered that off is not really the cause of the revolution, but the triggerers were there, obviously. And this is what the press usually focused on. One triggerer was a slight dip in the decline in oil revenues that created somewhat of an economic, I would say, crisis, but some tightening of the belt. But this wasn't enough to cause a revolution, obviously. Any viable regime would have survived that. Another trigger that often at that time was seen as the cause of the revolution was the question of human rights and torture in prisons. There was a great deal of international limelight on bad conditions of secret police and what was going on in prisons. And the Shah actually then tried to compromise and give concessions, and torture stopped in prisons in 78. The Shah promised that in future political dissidents would be tried in civilian courts, not in military courts, which had been the norm since 1953. And that then brought a slight opening of the political sphere. And then a lot of the, you could say, anger, grievances that had been simmering for the last 20, 25 years came out. So these two things really, I would say, that sparks of the revolution. Any viable regime could have survived that. So the real reason for the revolution, I think, goes back to 53, that the Shah, in fact, lost legitimacy in 53, because here he was brought to power by the CIA and MI6, not only brought to power, but brought to power by overthrowing the national hero of Iran, Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry and was generally regarded as the symbol of Iranian nationalism. So the Shah was seen from 53 onwards as somehow not anti-nationalist, lacking in patriotic credibility. So this gave the whole regime a sort of weakness. So when these crises occurred in 78, the American embassy actually reports that, well, the Shah can't find anyone to negotiate with because no one in the opposition considers him legitimate. Mm-hmm. So the American strategy had always been, if the Shah loosens up and basically permits an opposition, you could have a stable, secure regime. And this is a misunderstanding of the situation, because the opposition didn't really consider the Shah legitimate, and the Shah knew this. So every time he opened up, the opposition would question his legitimacy, and that would be the end of negotiations.
And who were the people that who opposing him? Who were the main players in Iranian politics?
Well, you could say by 78, almost everyone was in opposition. So you had millions of people out there. But
Mm-hmm.
in terms of political opposition, you can say it was three groups. One was the former supporters of the National Front, Mossadegh. Mossadegh had died by then, but his political heirs, the National Front, was very much there. They represented much more you could say, the intelligentsia, the professional middle class. Then there was also the various left groups, but factionalized in very different smaller groups. There was the traditional Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, but they were the Fedais. There was the Mujahideen, that was a radical Islamic guerrilla group. So these, they formed, I would say, the left wing of the opposition, organized opposition. And then what you had predominantly was Khomeini and his entourage of clerical disciples. They didn't represent the whole of the clerical hierarchy. In fact, the clerical hierarchy was very split. Some were pro-Shah, many were apolitical, but Khomeini became the main outspoken person among the clerics who began to criticize the Shah from 1963-64.
And 63 and 64, at this period, this is when the Shah had passed a law that would give clemency or protection for U.S. military personnel to be tried in Iranian courts.
And that's what Khomeini focused on, because, again, this would give him much credibility as a nationalist, because he was criticizing the Shah for selling out Iran to the U.S. military. But more interestingly enough, this was in the context of what was called the White Revolution. Mm-hmm. Now, the Shah, he realized from 53 that he had lost credibility, legitimacy. So what actually, the Shah was not stupid. He was trying to get legitimacy some other way. And he tried various ways of getting legitimacy. But one way of he tried was to launch what was called first the land reform, and then it became known as the White Revolution.
And interject one moment, wasn't the land reform not really initiated by him, but encouraged and proposed by American State Department?
It was, but also the Minister of Agriculture was actually a former quite leftist, Rafsanjani, who had been talking about land reform. But again, there was a pressure from the U.S., but the Shah quickly actually removed Rafsanjani because he saw Rafsanjani could be a potential threat to him, because Rafsanjani got a lot of support from peasants as a result of that. And the Shah then co-opted the White Revolution to appear as basically the leader of the country, as a revolutionary leader, as a way of getting legitimacy. It's a bit like a Bismarckian type of revolution from above to undercut the opposition. But this actually boomeranged, because what the land reform did and the White Revolution did, also with the White Revolution, was the introduction of voting for women. It alienated a lot of the clergy. So from then on, in 1953, some of the clergy had supported the monarch, but as a result of the White Revolution, much of the clergy then moved in opposition, not necessarily like Khomeini, but basically they tried to distance themselves from the regime. So when 1978 came along, there were not that many clerics, prominent clerics, that were willing to be associated or support openly the Shah. Even the ones who were royalists rather preferred to keep their mouth shut, because as a result of the White Revolution, they were the regime was seen as contaminated.
Now, you were saying that the Shah, or the reason why his regime was so fragile, is the source at 1953. He lacked legitimacy, but why did some faction of the clerics find him to be legitimate? Why did they give their weight behind him?
Well, by 1978, very few did, but the ones that would have done, and I mean, did privately, is because historically in Iran, Shiism and monarchism had been basically twins.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in traditional Shiite literature in Iran, the regime has to be a monarchy. And even if the monarch is bad, you accept the monarch because the alternative is considered anarchy.
Mm. That is a theory in one of the Islamic schools of thought. And some school of thought of Islam says you don't go against the ruler because something worse might follow.
Yes. And the paramount Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah Iran, Burujerdi, he died in 1961.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very strict. He was described as a Quartist, i.e., the clerical leaders should not be involved in politics. So implicitly, it means you support the regime, because if you're not getting involved in politics, you're supporting the status quo. So, and he was very basically dominant figure in the clerical hierarchy. No one would dare to openly criticize Burujerdi. He was Baraja Taghlid. Occasionally, you get a Baraja Taghlid.
What does that mean exactly?
It means the source of imitation, emulation, the source of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
From the 19th century, every so often, one of the grand ayatollahs becomes paramount, and basically others submit to his rulings. And Burujerdi was the last of those. When he died 61, then you have a number of grand ayatollahs who have different views politically. And Khomeini comes first time he enters politics is after Burujerdi dies, when he begins to openly criticize the regime about the White Revolution.
So at this point, Khomeini is still in Iran. He has not been exiled yet, 63, 64. What was the year he was exiled?
He was exiled immediately after he denounced the capitulations to the American military advisors, the ones you mentioned, that America got special privileges, legal privileges. That was in 64. So as soon as he denounced that, he was deported from Iran to Turkey, and then from Turkey made his way to Najaf.
Najaf in Iraq, correct?
Iraq, yeah. So he was in Iraq from 64 until 78, yes, the revolution.
When he went to Najaf, and then he found himself in France. He was living outside of Paris in a supporter's household.
Very short, brief time. I mean, ironically, he was in Najaf from 64 on, and when the revolution started in Iran, the Shah actually persuaded Saddam Hussein to get rid of Khomeini. The notion was that if Khomeini was further away from Iran, he would be less dangerous. So Khomeini actually first tried to go to Kuwait. The Kuwaitis wouldn't accept him. The only place he could get a visa was Paris. And this was very ironic because in Paris, he had much easier communication with his supporters in Tehran. He could pick up the phone and talk directly to people in Paris. He couldn't have done that from Najaf to Tehran. So in a way, he also got access to international media, to Le Monde, New York Times, London Times, Observer in Paris, so it was easy to have press conferences in Paris, where in Najaf he wouldn't have had that audience.
Right, the Ba'ath Party would have kept a close eye on him and cut him off
Yes,
from media.
yeah.
I mean, the irony of French Enlightenment, and at the same time, France was a ally of the Shah at that time.
Yes, and it's not quite known what the politics are. I mean, there are some Iranian royalists who still argued that the Iranian Revolution was really a French conspiracy because they knew what would happen if the Shah came to Paris, and they also claimed that the French must have known that Shah was ill with cancer. Because the Shah's doctors were French. But there's it's very unlikely the French doctors would have actually told the French government that the Shah had terminal cancer. So I don't think the French conspiracy is really reflects reality. What the French were doing was, I think they took this a good opportunity to give refuge to Khomeini, and if Khomeini succeeded, then France would have basically have some good brownie points on that. The new regime would favor it didn't work out that way actually, because the revolution in Iran led to a government that actually ended up being pretty anti-French.
Even though at that time also the Shah, is it true that the Shah had believed that somehow the United States and the British were behind his demise and that they had some role in putting Khomeini in charge?
Yes, I mean, the royalists also, besides the French, they claimed that it must have been the British or the Americans, because who could organize such a revolution? At first, the Shah said it's the Russians doing it. And then he turned to the American ambassador and said, no, this is too big for the Russians. You must be doing it. And his argument was because he'd become pro-Palestinian, and therefore the Americans were trying to undermine him. This is, obviously a complete misreading of the revolution. Here you have millions of people in the street. They have grievances all along the line for 30 years. They don't need America or Britain to tell them that the Shah should go.
It's also odd that they would think the Shah had become an enemy of Israel, while Khomeini is criticizing the Shah for being an ally of Israel. So, I mean, everyone has their own narrative to fit their agenda. Khomeini's story is a bit, for me, kind of like Vladimir Lenin, in the sense that he's outside the country while the revolution is taking place, and he shows up and somehow takes control of the situation. But Khomeini has, in my opinion, has much more influence on the Iranian Revolution than Lenin did on the Russian October Revolution. What's your take on that analogy?
Yeah, I think, often the comparison is made, but there is, I think, a big difference. Lenin, of course, was important in the Russian Revolution, but he didn't have charisma. I mean, in November 1917, average Russian would not have known who Lenin was. They might have known Trotsky, because Trotsky had been more active in St. Petrograd, and he'd been the head of the Soviet council in Petrograd. But Lenin was basically outside outside revolutionary organizations. He was really an unknown. So Lenin's charisma came really later, especially after his death.
The legend was invented after his death.
Yeah. With Khomeini, from basically mid-1978, with the mass demonstrations, he is clearly the dominant figure. And you can see this among the religious elements. especially younger people who are not theologically trained, but basically Shiite believers.
Mm-hmm.
They don't call Khomeini just as an Ayatollah. They now began to call him as Imam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a very actually charged term, because I'm not sure in Lebanon, but in Iran, the word Imam was only used for the 12th Imams.
Mm-hmm. It's the same.
So
yeah.
They basically were considered semi-divine. If in the 19th, or even in the 1950s or 60s, if you called someone an imam, it would have been almost sacrilegious. You're violating a sacred term to use it to a normal human being.
We had in Lebanon what some people dubbed the lost imam as Imam Musa Sadr, who was originally from Iran and then found his way to Lebanon, and then was, I guess we can conclude, was killed by the former Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And he was also of Iranian heritage, correct?
Yeah. But if I remember rightly, he was called the hidden imam or lost imam after he disappeared, after he died.
Yeah, after he died.
When he was basically preaching in Lebanon, mm-hmm. I doubted anyone would have called him imam. It would have been considered sort of extraordinary.
I don't know for sure. I mean, I wasn't around in those days, but it was, every time I read it, it always started as Imam Musa Sadr.
Yeah.
And relatives of mine over there and people I know would refer to him as Imam Musa Sadr. So maybe it was not when he was alive, but after his demise.
Yeah. With Khomeini, it was basically, you could say, a shock for many traditionalists to have this term applied to a living person, mm-hmm. Coming back. So when he returned to Iran from Paris, he was then seen as the literal returning imam. So he refused to answer if he was the hidden imam retiring. Mm-hmm. He would sort of dismiss that, but he wouldn't oppose people calling him that. It's interesting because he clearly, for his supporters, he had some special authority, mm-hmm. that was more than a religious leader's authority.
But he had initially said that he did not want to install or create a religious system of government, that he had promised elections, he promised he would go back to the holy city of, or in their mind, holy city of Qums, and go on with his life. What happened?
Well, he was actually very much a politician. And you don't, as a partisan, you don't reveal all your cards at the wrong time. We don't really know what his plans were, but clearly his book, Velayat Faqih, that he lectures in Najaf from 10 years earlier, there already you have the structure of a clerical state. So it's the word, again, Velayat Faqih, that became predominant in Iran, is not a word that would resonate in the Sunni world. Mm-hmm. It sort of would be meaningless. But in the Iranian Shiism, the term Velayat Faqih has a long standing, but Khomeini gave it a new meaning. In traditional Islam, Velayat Faqih meant that certain clerical leaders would have authority over orphans, widows, and the insane. Mm-hmm. So they would be basically the guardians of people who can't rule themselves. So Khomeini took that term to whole national level, that the whole country needed a guardianship. Mm-hmm. And then the logic would be, who would be the guardians of the whole country? It would be those people who know the Sharia. Mm-hmm. Who are the people who know the Sharia are the clerics. And who are the most knowledgeable clerics on the Sharia are the senior clerics who specialize in fiqh, in the law. So there's some logic in that argument. And he had that already basically in his lectures from 10 years earlier. He didn't talk about it during the revolution, but after the revolution, the new constitution was really framed around that notion. So the first draft of the constitution was actually modeled on the French constitution, de Gaulle's constitution, very secular division of powers and strong president. Yeah. But then over that was the notion of Velayat Faqih as the clerics as the guardian of the whole system.
So you have Khomeini landing in Tehran with, in the post-Shah moment. And the Shah is gone by that time. He has about 2 to 3 million supporters gathering to see him. And many of his supporters were left-leaning, liberal types. How did they not know that this man had an alternative motive to establish a theocracy?
Well, I think the secular intelligentsia knew was already concerned. They already, yes, there was definitely from their point of view, people who had read, for instance, his Velayat Faqih. But by then, of course, you have massive people in the cities. Many of them are recent arrivals from villages. And for them, Khomeini was, in fact, like a living imam. And this is where the term actually charisma really comes in. And here, if I can digress to Weberian sociology, what Weber argues is, why do people obey? What is the basis of legitimacy? And his argument there is you obey because your tradition, customs say that. There's one way is, you could say, traditional way of legitimacy. Then the other is the bureaucratic, rational, modern way. But if the two are not there, broken, and in Iran the traditional system had been delegitimized by 1953, and a new system had not come into place, you have a vacuum. And in this vacuum is where Weber says charisma arises. So it's not a strong individual that creates charisma, it's the vacuum creates the opportunity for someone to appear and say, I have the answers. So that, custom tells you, tradition tells you that this is the right way, but I tell you this is the right way.
And that supersedes any sense of tradition. No, I understand. A couple final questions, and then I guess we can conclude for now. I want to say thank you again for joining me on the podcast. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Refocusing on the legacy of Ayatollah Khomeini, what solidified his rule? I mean, Iran could have gone in any direction. It had a large leftist opposition to the Shah. It was a large military, over almost 500,000 soldiers. There was a military elite that could have easily said, no, we won't let him land. How could Khomeini undermine the entire system?
Well, the army had disintegrated. It was basically a paper army that disintegrated once the Shah left. And the Shah never really built a structured military that could use force. But in that vacuum, when the army collapsed, what you had on a local level, literally on the neighborhood level, Mahalle in Iran it's called, I don't know in Lebanon what it's called, the district, the people who organized, especially the protest meeting, are basically the youth. high school kids, college kids,
University. Yeah.
often poor kids. They organized committees, comités.
Mhm.
And these committees during the revolution and towards the end actually then had access to weapons. So the committees became basically local revolutionary guards. And these revolutionary guards then became the nucleus of what became the Pasdaran, the revolutionary army of the new regime.
I guess the genesis of the IRGC.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in each neighborhood, you had this. In some neighborhoods, in fact, these comités were close to clerical leaders that were not pro-Khomeini. So there was a gradual purge of those. Mm-hmm. And the whole system was very systematically centralized and brought under the control of people Khomeini trusted, and they would obey Khomeini as the charismatic leader. So whatever Khomeini said, they would be willing to do that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it was a sort of gradual process after 79 of centralizing these very diverse and dispersed local committees.
So you mentioned...
It didn't mean really power, political power shifted to a very different class in society.
So it was a grounds up initiation to build his new, I guess, state security apparatus, you could say.
Yeah.
So he built this ground up, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, from young students backed by clerics. But he also, when he took control, purged some of his allies and members of the military elite.
Right. In the very early days, there were executions of some high-ranking generals who had actually opposed the army being neutral. It was not huge mass killings at that time. It was much more actually targeted executions.
But, there stories and history says from various sources that he had purged 20,000 members of the old Iranian elite, military elite. Is there any truth in that?
Well, it depends what you mean by purged. Forced retirements or people who left the country. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the executions, were not that high in 79, 80. The more high executions really come against the Mujahideen, his former allies, after 81, when the Mujahideen try an uprising against the Islamic Republic. That's when the real terror starts by the Pasdaran against the Mujahideen. And then some of the leftist groups who had been guerrillas before become victims of it, although they were not really associated with the Mujahideen.
But was the Mujahideen also receiving support from the Iraqi Ba'ath Party led by the dictator Saddam Hussein?
Not at that time. It was only after they were forced out of the country, after the failed uprising. Some took shelter in Iraq, and that's when Saddam Hussein started helping them. Yes. Yeah.
Was Saddam Hussein's suggestion to the Shah to execute Khomeini a motivation for Khomeini to also pursue a war against Iraq? Not that Iran started the war, but was that somehow a motivation?
I don't think so. No. I think Khomeini, the war, as you said, was initiated by Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
Iran was in no position to have initiated an aggressive policy right after the revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think Saddam Hussein thought it was a wonderful, easy opportunity to get back the Shatt al-Arab, which he had actually signed away to Iran in the Algiers Agreement.
That's right, in 75, yeah. I think, in 1975.
So he had a personal reason. Saddam Hussein had a personal reason to, try to rectify what had been done before. But where the issue really comes about the war is once Iran pushed Iraq out of Khorramshahr, across the border, then the question that very sensitive issue came up is, do you then end the war? Because at that point, Saddam Hussein was more than happy to end the war. And Khomeini made the decision to take the war into Iraq.
Which was a mistake. I think we can agree that was a mistake.
Definitely. And it was, I think, that prolonged the war. For actually much of the deaths and destruction came after that.
Right.
But the Iranian Republic is not willing to accept that mistake. Why? Because it was a Khomeini decision. We don't know how the decision was made, but it was really, I would say, a fatal decision. The war should have ended as soon as the Iraqis were forced out.
So, final question, and I hope I can bring you back to have a different discussion about the Iran-Iraq war if you are, if you're willing to do that. I think that's a separate discussion. What is the final judgment on the legacy for Ayatollah Khomeini for Iranians in Iran and in the diaspora?
Well, in Iran, actually, it's hard to figure out what really people think because, again, his charisma is there. If any criticism is seen as sacrilegious, so you can criticize other people in the hierarchy, but Khomeini is beyond criticism. In the diaspora, of course, he is seen as the real bogeyman, the epitome of everything the refugees from Iran see bad about the revolution. So it's like how
not really popular.
Yeah, how Russian exiles after 1917 would look at Lenin. It's the same way. He's the epitome of evil. And of course, the argument is that foreigners must have been behind him and so on. Otherwise, he wouldn't have accomplished this.
There's always that foreign actors conspiracy. I don't think it will ever get old. We'll never see the end of it, but that's why we have these discussions to try to get close to the truth. Dr. Irvan, thank you so much for your time, and until next time, I guess.
And thank you for your good questions.
Thank you.